one visual technique that I discovered during this process was the relationship between the near and the far. Because I realized pretty early on as I took these photographs, like I found myself standing in front of these gigantic piles of garbage and the things we waste. And initially I thought, this is the scale of our mass consumption that I'm seeing here for the first time. And it was like being able to take a tour of the Disneyland ride, you know, around behind the ride where no one gets to see, where there's this big ugly machine that runs the whole thing. It was like seeing the underbelly of our mass consumption. And I thought that what I was seeing was the scale of our mass consumption. I never stood in front of a pile of garbage, you know, that's like 5 or 10 times what you see on the screen. There's this massive pile. And it didn't take me long to realize that what I'm actually looking at right there is just some of one day of Seattle's garbage. That's not really the scale of our mass consumption at all. It's a tiny drop in the bucket, or like the tip of the iceberg of our mass consumption. And so I got interested in, like, how can I convey the scale of our consumption? How can I evoke it? Because I can't really show it. And so I started using compositional techniques like leaving only a very small amount of ground left for the viewer to stand on, metaphorically. So it kind of gives a sense of claustrophobia. And with this one, there's only a small amount of ground and only a small amount of air left to breathe. The image goes off both sides, so it leaves to the imagination how big it is. And the only nature in the image is marginalized off to one corner and it's out of focus. So I started using these, you know, in this one, it's left up to your imagination how many cars there are. So I'm trying to figure out how to evoke this feeling of kind of horror that I have of standing in front of these massive piles of what we waste. And at the same time, there's this strange beauty in it. Following in the tradition of pictorial large format color photography, of photographers like Richard Mizrak and Andreas Gursky, those guys used beauty as almost like a seductive tool to draw the viewer into an otherwise uncomfortable photograph and into an uncomfortable conversation about the subject. And so I began to use beauty in this way as a metaphor. Like with this image, when you stand back at a distance, what it hopefully looks like is an aerial photograph of, like you're flying over an industrial city of the future, or maybe like the Death Star in Star Wars. And then when you get up close, if you walk all the way up to the print of this piece, you see that all these little fine details, and you can tell that what you're actually looking at is lots and lots of computer hard drives. And I'm really interested in the relationship between the near and the far, because I came to our mass consumption like that. And many of the issues in our culture are kind of like that. Like if you stand back at a distance, it looks like one thing. And when you come up close to it, it completely changes. And an example is our electronic communications devices. And I'm holding one of those in my hand, 2 of those in my hand right now, a microphone, a wireless microphone, and a wireless slide clicker. Well, inside both of these electronic communications devices is a mineral called coltan. And coltan, it's in every single one of our cell phones and all of our other electronic communications devices. And most of the world's coltan comes from the Congo. And one of the main reasons why the Congo is such an ecological and cultural disaster right now is because of the mining of the coltan. The tribes have wars over who gets to control the land. There's child slavery and incredible cruelty that goes on in the mines. And the mountain gorillas live near the mines. And that's one of the reasons they're going extinct, is because of the mining of coltan so we can have electronic communications devices. So when you stand back at a distance, it looks pretty cool. You know, I get to talk through this device and I get to click from a distance and it looks pretty good. But when you zoom in and you just look at it from a much closer perspective, the picture just changes into something completely different. So this is one of the last images I did in this series. I call this series Intolerable Beauty. I'm trying to bring together this strange beauty in our waste and the kind of horror of the subject. And this is one of the last images in that series, and this is the one that was printed in the New York Times that kind of launched my career nationally. And as I got to begin exhibiting this work and doing public speaking about it, one of the things I found myself doing was talking about the statistics that I had been reading when I read about mass consumption. And so with this image, for example, I don't know how many phones this is, but it's like maybe 3,000, 2,000 or 3,000 phones. That's a tiny drop in the bucket of the actual number of phones that we throw out in the United States, which at the time was something like 140 million. And when I talk to people about this image, I would say we throw out 140 million cell phones every year in the United States, And every time I did that, I got this little tweak in the back of my mind, like, I don't know how many 140 million is. We need to have somebody that just like starts dancing every time that comes up. Like if we filled this room with cell phones from the ceiling or from the ground all the way up to the top of the ceiling, would that be 140,000? Or would it be 1.4 million? Or would it be 14 million? Like I don't even know within a factor of 1,000 how many phones 140 million phones is. These numbers, like these giant numbers that we talk to each other about, that we read about every day, in the millions or the billions, they're these incomprehensible numbers. And yet I was trying to use these statistics as a way of strengthening my artwork. And I got curious about, like, is there any way that I could photograph the actual quantities of the things we consume? Instead of just a pile of cell phones or a bunch of crushed cars or a random pile of garbage. Like I got interested in trying to depict the statistics that I had been reading about. And of course, as a photographer, there's no way to do it because there's no Mount Everest where all our garbage goes. You know, there's no Grand Canyon of cell phones or laptops or something that you can go and behold the cumulative effects of our mass consumption. It's divided up over hundreds of thousands of different locations, and none of the things that we consume are ever all collected in one place at one time. You know, the oil that we burn is divided up over tons of locations, and so as a photographer, I had to, as I thought about like how to convey the actual quantities of what we consume, I decided that rather than stay as a photographer and go photograph what I could photograph, I decided to leave photography behind and follow the subject that I was interested in, wherever that led me. And what it led me to is these digital constructions that began the series that I call Running the Numbers. So what I did with that series, one thing that annoyed me about this piece is that all anybody ever talked about when I exhibited it was how beautiful it is. And I was trying to use beauty as a tool. And I realized that in that conversation, I realized that I underestimated the audience for my work because they didn't need that much beauty. And it ended up that, you know, that I made it into a swirl. I took some photographs of from the Hubble Space Telescope with me of a nearby galaxy when I went to this place and stood back with the pictures and kind of took a day or so to arrange the cell phones into a swirl. And then there's a kind of color aspect to it. You can see I'm still holding on to my cosmic color theory all this time. And it's also shot in perspective, so the ones in the bottom are closer than the ones in the distance. And people would, you know, they'd ask me about what camera did I use and how do I get such fine detail, and that's all the discussion there was when I exhibited this work. And it made me annoyed because I want to talk about the subject, our mass consumption. And so when I did my Running the Numbers version of cell phones to show the actual quantity of the cell phones we consume, I called up my cell phone guy and I said, no color, just send me lots of gray cell phones. And I thought, there's not going to be a pattern to it, so there's not going to be a pattern for people to talk about how beautiful it is. It's not going to be in perspective, there's not going to be any swirl, and there's not going to be any color. It's just going to be lots and lots of gray cell phones. And that's about how many I got. So I just set them up on the floor of my studio with a camera looking straight down on them and lit it from all sides. Took a picture, which looked just like that. It's about, I can't remember, it's about 200 phones, I think. And then I stirred the phones around and took another picture. Well, if I take those two pictures now and join them together in Photoshop and very carefully stitch out the hard edge between the two, and the original picture is about a 10 megapixel digital image. So if I join those two together, now I've got a 20 megapixel image of 400 phones. And if I do that again and again for a few weeks, then I finally end up with this random noise pattern that doesn't look like anything. But if you walk up close, it's 426,000 very finely detailed cell phones. That's the actual quantity of phones that we discard in the United States every single day. I think that's the last, oh yeah, that's the last one. And that one is on exhibit at the Austin Museum.